On paper, it looked simple.
I
A
have to make
struggling
this right.
family restaurant,
No more
a loyal
delays.
son-in-law, and one small favor. Buy it, save it, keep it in the family. But what no one told him was that this wasn't just a restaurant. It was $400,000 in debt, a marriage hanging by a thread, and a test of loyalty he never saw coming. When he said no, his wife stopped speaking to him. His father-in-law called him a coward, and the entire family turned on him. So here's the question. Was he protecting his future or betraying his family? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because this story is about more than a business decision. It's about pride, pressure, and the quiet weight that settles on a man when everyone he loves expects him to fix something he didn't break. It's about what happens when loyalty comes with a price tag, and whether doing the responsible thing can still make you the villain in your own home. Michael Turner was 52 years old when the request came. He had spent 3 decades building a regional freight and logistics company from a single-use truck and a leased warehouse into a stable, profitable operation with contracts across 3 states. He believed in cash flow, contingency plans, and sleeping at night without creditors calling. He believed in saving for retirement, in paying for his kids' college without loans if he could, in living within his means even when success offered the temptation to stretch. His wife, Laura, came from a different kind of legacy. Her father, Frank Russo, had opened Russo's Italian Kitchen in 1996 in a modest strip mall outside Columbus, Ohio. For years it thrived on hand-tossed dough, red-checkered tablecloths, and a loyal customer base that celebrated birthdays and anniversaries under its warm lights. The restaurant survived the early 2000s downturn, rising food costs, and shifting neighborhood demographics. It even survived a kitchen fire in 2012 that nearly shut it down for good. What it struggled to survive was the modern era of delivery apps, rising labor expenses, and the pandemic that swept across the country in 2020, shuttering dining rooms and draining savings nationwide. Across the United States, independent restaurants were hit harder than almost any other industry during that period. According to data from the National Restaurant Association, tens of thousands of establishments closed permanently in 2020 and 2021, many after operating for decades. Government relief programs offered temporary support, but for many owners the loans delayed collapse rather than preventing it. Russo's was one of those businesses that reopened after lockdowns with hope, only to discover that customer habits had changed. Foot traffic never fully returned. Food costs rose sharply in 2022 and 2023. Staffing became difficult and expensive. Frank, proud and stubborn, refused to cut quality or shrink portions. He also refused to modernize aggressively, dismissing digital marketing and delivery partnerships as fads that diluted tradition. Revenue slipped month after month. By late 2024, the restaurant was operating at a loss. Suppliers were waiting longer for payment. The bank was sending letters. But inside the family, the narrative was different. They spoke of a temporary rough patch. They spoke of loyalty. They spoke of legacy. The request came during a Sunday dinner at Frank and his wife Diane's home. Pasta was served. Wine was poured. The conversation felt ordinary until Frank cleared his throat and placed a manila folder on the table. He slid it toward Michael with a quiet seriousness that shifted the room's temperature. Inside were financial statements, loan documents, and a handwritten note outlining what he called a solution. The bank was willing to restructure the debt if a new guarantor stepped in. The total outstanding obligations, including back rent, supplier balances, and a high-interest emergency loan taken during the pandemic, amounted to just under $400,000. Frank explained that with fresh capital and stronger management, the restaurant could recover. He said Michael had the experience and resources to turn it around. He said it would stay in the family. Laura reached for Michael's hand under the table and squeezed it. She said, softly, that this was their chance to preserve something meaningful. The room felt heavy with expectation. Michael didn't answer that night. He took the folder home and spent the next week reviewing every page. He asked for additional documents. He requested tax filings. Quietly, he called his longtime accountant, a careful man named David Harper, and asked for an independent review. What came back was far worse than the optimistic summary presented at dinner. Revenue had declined for 3 consecutive years. Payroll costs were consuming a disproportionate share of income. There were unpaid sales taxes from a prior quarter. The lease on the building would expire in 18 months with a significant rent increase baked into the renewal terms. Even if he paid off the immediate debt, the business model would require substantial restructuring to survive. That meant renegotiating supplier contracts, trimming staff, adjusting menu prices, and investing in technology and marketing that Frank had resisted. It meant stepping into a leadership role that would inevitably sideline his father-in-law. Michael saw not a simple rescue but a multi-year commitment with uncertain returns and guaranteed family tension. When he shared his concerns with Laura, the conversation shifted from numbers to emotion. She accused him of focusing only on risk and ignoring the heart of the matter. She reminded him that her parents had helped them with childcare when their children were young. She reminded him of holidays spent in the restaurant after hours, of the pride Frank felt when customers complimented a dish. Michael responded that pride didn't pay creditors. He pointed out that tying up $400,000 plus additional operating capital would strain their own financial security. He mentioned retirement planning. He mentioned college tuition. The discussion grew sharper. Laura asked whether he would feel the same if it were his own father asking. Michael said he might feel the same because math doesn't change based on bloodlines. That answer landed poorly. Over the next few days, communication between them became strained. Silence settled into spaces that had once been filled with routine conversation. Word spread quickly within the extended family. Laura's brother, Anthony, who had occasionally worked at the restaurant but never managed it, called Michael one evening and suggested that successful men support family ventures. He hinted that refusing would look selfish. Laura's sister posted a vague message on social media about people who forget where they came from. Frank stopped calling altogether. Diane sent a text saying she hoped Michael would reconsider for the sake of unity. The pressure was constant, subtle but persistent. At work, Michael tried to focus on shipping contracts and warehouse expansions, yet his mind kept returning to the folder on his desk at home. He revisited the spreadsheets, ran new projections, and imagined worst-case scenarios. What if a recession hit? What if a major client left his logistics company? What if he needed liquidity for his own business? He had always believed that a man's primary responsibility was to the stability of his immediate household. But he also believed in loyalty and reputation. Being labeled the son-in-law who refused to help weighed on him more than he expected. Another dinner was arranged, this time with clearer stakes. Frank laid out his vision passionately. He described menu revamps, community events, and partnerships with local farms. He insisted the downturn was temporary. He emphasized that other restaurants had recovered after the pandemic, citing articles about resilient small businesses across America. He spoke about legacy and how Russo's carried the family name. Michael listened carefully and then spoke in a calm, measured tone. He explained the financial realities as he saw them. He detailed the debt structure, the tax liabilities, and the looming lease renegotiation. He said that if he were to invest, he would require full operational control and the authority to make difficult changes. The room fell quiet. Frank's face tightened. He said he would never hand over his life's work only to watch it be transformed into something unrecognizable. He accused Michael of wanting ownership without respect for tradition. Michael responded that without change there might be nothing left to preserve. The conversation ended without resolution. Weeks passed. The bank increased its pressure. Suppliers began demanding cash on delivery. Staff turnover rose as rumors of instability circulated. Laura grew increasingly distant. She slept in the guest room on several occasions, saying she needed space to think. The children sensed tension and asked careful questions that neither parent answered fully. Michael found himself staring at the ceiling at night, calculating scenarios in the dark. He imagined signing the papers, wiring the funds, and announcing to his own employees that he would be dividing his attention between two businesses. He imagined the strain of managing a declining restaurant industry while maintaining his logistics company in a competitive market. According to industry data, restaurant profit margins are typically thin even in strong years, often ranging between 3 and 5%. In volatile economic periods, that margin can evaporate entirely. He knew that stepping in would not guarantee success. It would guarantee exposure. The turning point came not in a dramatic confrontation, but in a quiet phone call. The bank informed Frank that without a new guarantor within 30 days, foreclosure proceedings would begin. Frank called Michael directly for the first time in weeks. His voice sounded older, less defiant. He asked, plainly, whether Michael would sign. Michael paused for a long moment before answering. He said he could not put his family's financial future at risk for a business that required more than money to survive. He said he was willing to help in other ways, to advise, to connect Frank with consultants, to explore structured partnerships, but he would not assume the debt personally. There was a long silence on the line. Frank responded that sometimes family means stepping up even when the numbers look bad. Michael replied that sometimes leadership means recognizing when to let go. The call ended without agreement. Within 2 months, Russo's Italian kitchen filed for bankruptcy protection. News of the closure spread through the local community. Longtime customers expressed sadness online. Some blamed economic conditions. Others blamed management decisions. Privately, Diane called Michael and admitted that the debts had grown larger than anyone realized. Frank, after initial anger, began to accept that the business might have needed more than a financial injection. The marriage between Michael and Laura did not collapse, but it carried scars. Counseling sessions followed. Difficult conversations unfolded about boundaries, expectations, and the difference between support and self-sacrifice. Over time, the intensity of the conflict eased, replaced by a sober recognition that hard decisions rarely satisfy everyone involved. Years later, when people recount the story, they often simplify it. They ask whether Michael was heartless or prudent. They ask whether loyalty should override spreadsheets. They frame it as a binary choice between family and finance. But those who live through it understand that the reality was layered. Independent businesses across America close every year, sometimes despite passion and history. Family dynamics complicate what would otherwise be straightforward business judgments. The question remains lingering in the background. If you were sitting at that table, staring at $400,000 in obligations and a room full of expectant faces, would you have signed? Would you have risked retirement savings, college funds, and peace of mind to preserve a legacy? Or would you have drawn a line, knowing it might cost you relationships in the short term? In the end, the restaurant closed, the debts were settled through legal channels, and life moved forward. Yet the deeper issue remains unresolved, echoing quietly in households across the country where business and blood intersect. Was he protecting his future, or was he betraying his family? The restaurant had been in the family for 27 years. Russo's Italian Kitchen opened its doors in 1998, founded by Frank Russo with recipes passed down from his mother and a loan he once described as the scariest signature of his life. It survived the early 2000s slowdown. It survived rising food costs, competition from national chains, and a kitchen fire that forced it to close for 3 months while repairs were made. When the pandemic swept across the United States, dining rooms went dark nationwide, and like thousands of independent establishments, Russo's pivoted to takeout and delivery just to stay alive. According to industry reports, more than 90,000 restaurants across America closed permanently during that period, many after decades of operation. Russo's managed to reopen, but reopening did not mean recovering. Revenue never returned to pre-pandemic levels. Labor costs increased. Suppliers raised prices. The margins grew thinner each quarter until survival depended less on customers and more on credit. But now it was bleeding money. $400,000 in accumulated debt, layered across bank loans, overdue vendor payments, and deferred obligations that had quietly piled up while the family insisted the downturn was temporary. Frank Russo still arrived every morning before sunrise, still tasted the sauce before service, still believed the right special or a loyal crowd on Friday night could turn the tide. Yet the numbers told a different story. The bank was no longer patient. Suppliers had begun shortening payment terms, and the lease renewal clause, buried in fine print, promised a rent increase that would strain an already fragile operation. The restaurant was not just underperforming, it was cornered, and there was only one person financially stable enough to save it. Him. Michael Turner, 52 years old, owner of a logistics company built from decades of disciplined growth. The same Michael who believed in balance sheets over optimism, who tracked cash flow with precision, who had avoided major debt after watching his own father struggle through a failed hardware store in the late 1980s. In the Russo family's eyes, Michael represented stability. He had liquidity. He had creditworthiness. He had the reputation and capital that could convince the bank to restructure everything. If he signed the guarantees and absorbed the debt, the immediate crisis would vanish. Payroll could be covered. Vendors could be paid. The doors could stay open. The story could continue. But beneath that solution lay uncomfortable questions. Was this really about saving the restaurant, or was it about transferring responsibility? If Michael stepped in, would he be rescuing a family legacy or quietly underwriting years of managerial resistance and financial denial? He had already seen the internal statements. Revenue had declined 3 years in a row. Payroll consumed an unsustainable share of income. Deferred maintenance was visible in aging kitchen equipment and postponed upgrades. Even if he cleared the debt, he would need to modernize operations, renegotiate contracts, and make staffing decisions that could fracture the family further. Saving Russo's would not mean preserving it as it was. It would mean reshaping it entirely. And Frank Russo had never been a man eager to surrender control. Or was Michael simply being used as a bailout plan? That accusation lingered in his mind after each tense conversation. At family gatherings, the tone shifted from casual to cautious. Laura avoided direct confrontation but reminded him of childhood memories tied to the restaurant. Birthdays celebrated in the corner booth, homework done at a table near the kitchen while Frank closed up for the night. Anthony spoke about loyalty in broad terms, suggesting that success carries obligations. Diane mentioned sacrifice, recalling how Frank once mortgaged their home to keep the restaurant alive during its early years. The message was clear without being explicitly stated. Michael's refusal would not be viewed as a financial judgment. It would be interpreted as a personal rejection. And what happened at that final family dinner changed everything. It was meant to be decisive, a moment to either commit or walk away. The folder of documents sat again on the table, thicker this time, accompanied by revised projections that assumed improved sales and cost reductions. Michael listened carefully as Frank described upcoming community events, partnerships with local suppliers, and a renewed marketing push. Laura watched her husband with expectation in her eyes. When it was Michael's turn to speak, he did not raise his voice. He outlined the risks calmly. He explained that assuming the debt would expose their own savings, their retirement accounts, and potentially even his business if cross-collateralization became necessary. He said that if he invested, he would require full operational authority and structural changes. That condition landed harder than the refusal itself. Frank stiffened. He said Russo's was his life's work, not a corporate experiment. The room tightened with silence. In that moment, the conflict crystallized. This was no longer just about money. It was about identity. Frank saw the restaurant as proof of resilience and heritage. Michael saw it as a distressed asset in a volatile industry. Laura saw it as the heartbeat of her childhood. Each perspective carried truth, and none could coexist without compromise. When Michael finally stated that he could not sign under the current terms, the air seemed to drain from the room. No shouting followed, only a heavy quiet that felt more final than anger. Frank looked at him and said, slowly, that sometimes family means stepping up even when the numbers say otherwise. Michael replied that sometimes protecting your family means recognizing limits, even when it hurts. From that dinner forward, the divide widened. Communication between Michael and Laura grew strained. Anthony accused him of valuing profit over people. Diane sent a brief message expressing disappointment. Frank withdrew into silence, focusing on daily operations while negotiations with the bank intensified. The financial clock continued ticking. Industry analysts had already warned that many independent restaurants operating on pandemic-era debt would struggle as interest rates rose and consumer spending shifted. Russo's was not unique in its distress, but for the Russo family, it felt singular and personal. Every unpaid invoice carried emotional weight. Every empty table during lunch service felt like an indictment. As foreclosure deadlines approached, the practical reality became unavoidable. Without new capital or a guarantor, the bank would proceed. Michael revisited his spreadsheets one final time, confirming projections he already understood. The risk was significant, the potential return uncertain, the personal cost already visible in his strained marriage. He considered compromise structures, minority stakes, advisory roles, but each option required cooperation and transparency that had been fragile at best. Ultimately, he chose not to sign. The decision was communicated directly, calmly, and without theatrics. It was received with visible hurt. The fallout unfolded over the next weeks. Suppliers tightened terms. Staff members quietly sought other employment. News spread within the local community that Russo's was in trouble. Some customers increased visits in solidarity. Others drifted away, uncertain of its future. The bank initiated formal proceedings. Bankruptcy became inevitable. When the announcement was finally made, it was framed as an unfortunate casualty of difficult economic times. Publicly, the family maintained unity. Privately, the fractures remained. Laura and Michael entered counseling, confronting the deeper issue beneath the restaurant's collapse. Expectations unspoken for years, assumptions about what marriage required when family legacy collided with financial caution. In the months that followed, as equipment was auctioned and the neon sign was removed from the storefront, a quiet realization settled over everyone involved. The decision had never been purely about a restaurant. It was about boundaries, responsibility, and the uncomfortable truth that love does not eliminate risk. For Michael Turner, the question still echoes in quieter moments. He preserved his financial stability. He protected his business. But he also watched a chapter of his wife's childhood close permanently. For Frank Russo, pride had sustained him for decades, yet it had also delayed difficult adaptations. For Laura, loyalty to both her father and her husband forced a reckoning she had never anticipated. So the central question remains, lingering long after the doors of Russo's shut for the final time. Was this truly an attempt to save a beloved institution, or an effort to transfer its burdens to the one man capable of absorbing them? Was Michael Turner prudent, or was he the villain of a story written by expectation and legacy? And if you had been seated at that final dinner, facing $400,000 in debt and the silent judgment of those closest to you, what choice would you have made? Michael Turner was 52 years old when everything began to shift, but his story started decades earlier in a small rented house on the edge of Dayton, Ohio. His father worked maintenance at a manufacturing plant, his mother part-time at a grocery store, and money was discussed in careful tones around the dinner table. He grew up watching bills get sorted before anything else, watching his parents choose practicality over comfort. College was never guaranteed. Stability was earned. When he was 22, he bought a used delivery truck with savings scraped together from warehouse shifts and small side jobs. He slept 4 hours a night in those early years, driving routes himself, handling invoices by hand, tracking fuel costs in worn ledger books that he still keeps in a filing cabinet today. There were no investors, no silent partners waiting to absorb losses. Every expansion came from retained earnings and cautious planning. Every new hire meant sleepless nights calculating payroll against projected revenue. He built everything from scratch. No bailouts, no shortcuts, just 30 years of risk and sacrifice layered one decision at a time. By his early 40s, Michael's logistics company had grown into a regional operation with steady contracts supplying distribution centers across 3 states. He employed dozens of drivers and warehouse staff, many of whom had been with him for over a decade. He reinvested profits carefully, avoiding excessive leverage even when competitors expanded aggressively with borrowed capital. His office walls carried framed photographs from the early days, the first truck parked outside a rented garage, the first warehouse lease signed with trembling optimism, the first holiday party where he could finally afford catered food instead of homemade dishes. At home, he and Laura lived in a modest suburban house chosen not for display, but for proximity to good schools. Their 2 teenage children were beginning to look at colleges, discussing tuition costs and future careers. Michael tracked college savings accounts with the same discipline he applied to freight contracts. To him, financial planning was not coldness, it was protection. It was the quiet promise that his children would have options he never did. Laura understood his drive, but she came from a different rhythm of life. Her father, Frank Russo, embodied the old-world restaurant ethos passed down through generations of Italian-American families who believed food was more than commerce. Russo's Italian kitchen was not simply a business on a balance sheet. It was the stage upon which birthdays were celebrated and anniversaries toasted. Frank ran the kitchen with visible pride, greeting regulars by name, insisting on quality even when margins tightened. The restaurant had once thrived on word-of-mouth loyalty and community presence. For years, that formula worked. The dining room was filled on weekends, and the scent of garlic and tomato sauce became synonymous with comfort for families in the neighborhood. Frank believed consistency and reputation were enough to weather any storm. The storm that changed everything was not singular but cumulative. When the pandemic forced restaurants nationwide to close their dining rooms, Russo's pivoted to takeout like thousands of others. Industry data would later show that independent restaurants were among the hardest-hit sectors, with closures reaching historic levels. Russo's reopened, but the ground beneath it had shifted. Customer habits leaned toward delivery apps and online ordering systems that Frank viewed with skepticism. Food costs surged due to supply chain disruptions. Labor became harder to secure and more expensive to retain. Frank resisted significant menu price increases, fearing it would alienate loyal patrons. He delayed investing in updated point-of-sale systems and digital marketing campaigns, trusting that tradition and word of mouth would restore what had been lost. Revenue declined steadily. Fixed costs remained. Debt crept upward quietly, then visibly. Within the Russo household, the narrative remained hopeful. Frank spoke of temporary downturns and seasonal fluctuations. He pointed to nights when the dining room filled and reminded everyone that resilience had defined his career. Diane supported him, believing that perseverance had carried them through previous challenges. Laura, caught between admiration for her father's determination and awareness of her husband's analytical approach, tried to believe both could coexist. Yet numbers do not bend to sentiment indefinitely. As months passed, unpaid invoices stacked in drawers. Short-term loans filled gaps. The pride that had sustained Russo's for decades began to mask deeper vulnerability. Pride can keep a business alive, but it can also blind you. Michael watched from a careful distance at first. He noticed the smaller crowds during visits, the aging equipment in the kitchen, the conversations that shifted quickly when finances came up. He offered suggestions gently, mentioning delivery partnerships and cost reviews, but his advice was often met with polite dismissal. Frank saw modernization as a compromise of identity, an erosion of authenticity. To him, Russo's represented hard-earned independence in a competitive industry. To Michael, it represented an operation vulnerable to structural pressures reshaping restaurants across America. Neither man was entirely wrong. They were simply operating from different experiences and definitions of security. At home, the contrast between their worlds was subtle but constant. Michael reviewed quarterly reports at the kitchen table while Laura fielded calls from her parents about fluctuating sales. He spoke of diversification and contingency reserves. They spoke of tradition and loyalty. The tension was not explosive at first. It lingered quietly, surfacing in small disagreements about risk and responsibility. As college brochures began arriving for their children, Michael felt the weight of long-term planning more intensely. He knew tuition costs were climbing nationally. He knew retirement required disciplined savings. He also knew that a single large financial misstep could undo years of cautious growth. The stage was set long before the folder of debt documents ever crossed the dinner table. Michael Turner, self-made and disciplined, believed stability was built through calculated risk and firm boundaries. Frank Russo, proud patriarch of a 27-year-old restaurant, believed legacy was preserved through loyalty and persistence. Laura stood between them, shaped by both philosophies. The restaurant's decline after the pandemic was not just an economic event. It was a slow erosion of certainty. Each declining month narrowed the options available. Each unpaid bill increased urgency. And then came the proposal. The proposal did not arrive in a boardroom or through an attorney's office. It came on a Sunday evening at Frank and Diane Russo's dining table, the same table where birthdays had been celebrated and holidays shared for years. The mood at first felt familiar. Pasta was served. Wine glasses clinked. Conversation drifted from the children's school plans to neighborhood gossip. Then Frank grew quiet. He reached beside his chair and lifted a thick folder, its edges worn, its contents carefully arranged. Without theatrics, he slid it across the polished wood toward Michael Turner. His voice was steady but heavy when he spoke. "We don't want investors. We want family." The words hung in the air with a weight that shifted the room. This was not a casual request. It was an appeal rooted in history, pride, and expectation. Inside the folder were documents that told a different story from the hopeful tone Frank had tried to maintain over the past year. Detailed loan statements showed balances approaching $400,000. There were notices from suppliers indicating past due payments that had rolled over month after month. Payroll summaries revealed weeks when revenue barely covered staff wages. A letter from the bank outlined the next steps if a restructuring agreement could not be reached, including language that referenced foreclosure proceedings and potential seizure of assets. The numbers were precise, clinical, and unforgiving. Russo's Italian kitchen was no longer facing a temporary setback. It was confronting a financial wall. Frank began explaining the situation with the urgency of someone who believed time was running out. He spoke about rising food costs and staffing shortages that had hit independent restaurants across the country. He mentioned how loyal customers still praised the food, how weekend nights remained strong, how a fresh infusion of capital could stabilize operations. He insisted that the foundation was solid, that what Russo's needed was breathing room. Michael listened without interruption, flipping through pages he already suspected would confirm what he feared. Laura watched him carefully, her expression a mixture of hope and tension. Diane sat quietly, hands folded, as though bracing for impact. The reality became unmistakable as the discussion deepened. The debt was layered. A pandemic-era emergency loan carried high interest. Vendor balances had been extended beyond typical credit terms. Tax payments had been deferred to preserve cash flow. The lease renewal clause would trigger a significant rent increase within 18 months. Even if Michael cleared the immediate $400,000, additional operating capital would likely be necessary to modernize equipment and stabilize cash flow. This was not a short-term bridge. It was a structural intervention. Frank framed it as a partnership, but the documents revealed that any new guarantor would assume personal responsibility if the business failed to recover. Michael understood immediately what that meant. His own assets, possibly even his logistics company, could be exposed depending on how the agreements were structured. They weren't asking him to invest. They were asking him to absorb the debt. The distinction mattered. An investment implies calculated risk with shared governance and defined returns. Absorbing debt implies stepping into liabilities created over time, liabilities influenced by decisions he did not make. The room fell into a long silence after the implications settled. Michael closed the folder gently and rested his hands on it. He could feel Laura's gaze fixed on him. He could sense Frank's pride straining against vulnerability. In that pause, the difference between business logic and family loyalty sharpened. Laura broke the silence softly but firmly. It's what family does. Her voice carried conviction, shaped by years of watching her father pour himself into the restaurant. To her, the request was less about spreadsheets and more about gratitude and solidarity. She remembered childhood afternoons spent at a corner table while Frank prepped for dinner service. She remembered the pride in his voice when he described expanding the dining room after a successful year. Supporting the restaurant felt like honoring that history. Michael understood the emotion behind her words, but he also understood the mathematics behind the documents. Love did not erase liabilities. Loyalty did not neutralize interest rates. Frank leaned forward, emphasizing that he wasn't looking for outsiders to dictate changes or dilute the family name. He believed that with Michael's financial backing and experience, Russo's could stabilize without losing its identity. He spoke of community support and seasonal promotions. He spoke of resilience. What he did not fully acknowledge was how much control would inevitably shift if Michael became the guarantor. Responsibility without authority would be unsustainable. Authority without friction would be unlikely. The proposal contained invisible consequences that extended beyond the balance sheet. If Michael accepted, he would not only shoulder financial risk, he would enter the operational heart of a business defined by Frank's lifelong pride. Michael's response that evening was measured. He did not refuse outright. He asked questions about cash flow projections, supplier renegotiations, and lease terms. He requested full access to financial records, tax filings, and vendor contracts. Frank agreed, perhaps assuming that scrutiny would confirm his optimism. The dinner ended without resolution, but tension lingered long after the plates were cleared. On the drive home, Laura remained quiet. Michael sensed that the decision ahead would shape more than their finances. It would test their alignment as partners. But what they didn't know was that he had already looked at the numbers. Earlier that week, after the initial hint that a request might be coming, Michael had discreetly asked his accountant, David Harper, to conduct an independent review of the restaurant's publicly available filings and preliminary statements Frank had shared informally. The early assessment had been sobering. Declining revenue trends, thin margins, debt servicing costs consuming a dangerous portion of cash flow. The deeper review he would request after that dinner would only reinforce those concerns. Michael understood that sentiment could not reverse structural decline. He also understood that once he signed, reversing course would be nearly impossible. As he lay awake that night, the proposal replayed in his mind. For $100,000. Past due suppliers. Payroll stretched thin. A bank signaling impatience. And the quiet certainty in Laura's voice when she said it's what family does. He weighed scenarios the way he always had, projecting best cases and worst cases across spreadsheets that existed only in his thoughts. If he agreed, he would need operational control. If he declined, he would fracture trust. The choice was not between good and bad. It was between two forms of loss. And the family believed the decision rested squarely with him. After that dinner, Michael Turner did what he had trained himself to do for 30 years whenever risk appeared on the horizon. He removed emotion from the equation and followed the numbers. Quietly, without announcing it to Laura or Frank Russo, he called his accountant, David Harper, and asked for a full forensic review of Russo's Italian kitchen. Not a surface glance, a deep examination. Cash flow trends, tax filings, vendor contracts, lease agreements, payroll obligations. Michael provided every document he had been given and requested additional disclosures under the explanation that he needed clarity before making any commitment. David agreed, understanding that $400,000 in debt was not a casual favor. Over the next 2 weeks, spreadsheets were exchanged, statements reconciled, and line items questioned. What began as due diligence slowly transformed into something closer to an investigation. The first issue that surfaced was revenue presentation. The summary Frank Russo had shown at the dinner table emphasized gross sales during peak weekends and seasonal highs. What it did not clearly reflect was the sustained decline in weekday revenue and the erosion of net profit after expenses. When averaged across the fiscal year, actual operating income was far lower than the optimistic projection suggested. Certain months had been highlighted, others were buried in aggregated figures. It was not necessarily fraudulent, but it was selective. The restaurant was not trending upward. It was trending downward, steadily and consistently. Then came the tax records. Deferred payments during the pandemic had accumulated. Some payroll tax obligations remained outstanding. Interest and penalties were beginning to attach. The total was manageable in isolation, but combined with vendor arrears and loan repayments, it formed a tight financial vice. There were also personal expenses that had been routed through the business account over time. Vehicle payments, family travel categorized under supplier meetings, insurance premiums that blurred the line between commercial and personal coverage. Individually, each expense might have seemed minor. Collectively, they reflected a pattern of informal financial management that would complicate any restructuring. Cleaning up those accounts would require transparency and difficult conversations. The lease review added another layer of urgency. The property housing Russo's Italian kitchen was secured under a contract set to expire in 18 months. The renewal clause included a significant rent increase tied to market adjustments in the area, which had recently experienced redevelopment and rising property values. If Michael assumed the debt, he would also be assuming exposure to that impending rent escalation. Relocating the restaurant would incur renovation and equipment costs. Staying put would mean absorbing higher fixed expenses in a business already struggling to maintain margin. There was no easy path forward. Every option required capital, operational overhaul, and time. As the findings accumulated, David summarized the situation in language Michael understood immediately. The current structure was unsustainable without significant change. Even with a cash infusion to clear the $400,000, the underlying cost structure and declining demand would likely continue eroding profitability. Modernization would be necessary. Staffing adjustments would be unavoidable. Marketing and digital ordering systems would require investment. Frank Russo's approach, rooted in tradition and loyalty, had carried the restaurant for decades, but the industry landscape had shifted. This wasn't a struggling business. It was a sinking ship. Michael sat alone in his office late one evening, The compiled report opened before him. He felt no satisfaction in the conclusion, only confirmation. The image of Russo's as a family institution clashed with the stark language of financial risk. He considered the possibility that he was overanalyzing. That caution was morphing into fear. But was he being paranoid or rational? That question lingered longer than any spreadsheet. He had seen companies collapse under the weight of optimism before. He had watched competitors overextend and disappear within a year. Prudence had preserved his own business through volatile markets. Yet this was not a competitor or a client. This was Laura's family. The tension escalated unexpectedly when Laura discovered the investigation. She found the printed report on Michael's desk one afternoon while searching for a different document. When he returned home that evening, she was waiting in the kitchen, the pages spread across the counter like evidence in a trial. Her expression was not angry at first. It was hurt. "You hired an accountant to audit my parents?" she asked quietly. Michael tried to explain that it was standard procedure before assuming significant liability. He emphasized that any responsible decision required full transparency. Laura's voice rose slightly as she responded, "You don't trust my family?" The words landed harder than any accusation from Frank or Anthony. For Laura, the investigation felt like betrayal. It implied suspicion, doubt, and distance. For Michael, it was protection. He reminded her that if he signed the guarantee, their home, their savings, and potentially his logistics company could be exposed. He spoke of their children's college funds, of retirement timelines, of worst-case scenarios he had spent decades learning to anticipate. Laura countered with memories of her father's sacrifices and the humiliation he would feel if outsiders dissected his books. The discussion shifted from numbers to loyalty within minutes. What had begun as a financial evaluation was now a referendum on trust. The atmosphere in their home tightened. Conversations grew shorter. Shared routines became strained. Laura accused Michael of viewing her family as liabilities. Michael felt cornered by expectations that dismissed legitimate risk. The restaurant's debt was no longer the sole issue. The deeper conflict lay in how each defined responsibility. To Laura, responsibility meant stepping in when loved ones were cornered. To Michael, responsibility meant safeguarding the future he had built through discipline and restraint. The investigative findings had illuminated more than financial instability. They exposed philosophical differences long overshadowed by day-to-day life. Frank remained unaware of the full extent of Michael's review at first, though he sensed hesitation. When word eventually reached him through Laura that external analysis had been conducted, his reaction was swift. He interpreted it as a sign that Michael saw the restaurant not as family, but as a transaction. Pride stiffened his posture during their next conversation. He insisted that Russo's had survived worse and would rebound with support. Michael did not argue aggressively. He simply reiterated the facts. The numbers were what they were. Hope could not erase deficits. By the time the next family gathering approached, the emotional landscape had shifted dramatically. The decision ahead was no longer a matter of writing a check or declining politely. It had become a collision of identity, loyalty, and pride. The investigation had stripped away comforting illusions and replaced them with uncomfortable clarity. Laura felt wounded. Frank felt scrutinized. Michael felt isolated in his reasoning. And that's when it stopped being about money. Once the accountant's findings surfaced and Laura confronted him about the investigation, the shift inside the Russo family was immediate and unmistakable. What had once been quiet pressure turned into open judgment. Laura's sister posted a carefully worded message on Facebook about loyalty and how success can make people forget who stood beside them when they had nothing. She didn't mention Michael Turner by name, but within the family circle, the meaning was clear. Comments from friends praised the importance of sticking together through hard times. Screenshots were shared in private group chats. The narrative was forming without him present. Soon after, Laura's brother called Michael directly. His tone was blunt, stripped of pretense. He said Michael was being cold, that any real family man would step in without dissecting spreadsheets. He suggested that sometimes character is revealed not by how you build wealth, but by how you use it. Michael listened quietly and ended the call without escalating the argument, but the word cold echoed long after. Frank Russo stopped answering Michael's calls altogether. Messages went unreturned. At family gatherings, conversation became strained and transactional. Diane attempted brief attempts at diplomacy, but even she seemed to view Michael's hesitation as a wound to family pride. The isolation deepened. In the Turner household, the tension was no longer contained to private conversations behind closed doors. Laura began sleeping in the guest room on several nights, explaining that she needed space to think. The emotional distance between them felt wider than the physical hallway separating bedrooms. Their teenage children, perceptive enough to sense change, overheard fragments of arguments about debt, risk, and loyalty. They asked careful questions about whether their grandparents were losing the restaurant. Michael tried to reassure them without revealing the full strain, but children can detect what parents attempt to conceal. He wasn't just refusing to buy a restaurant. He was rejecting their legacy. That was how it was framed within the Russo family. Russo's Italian kitchen represented decades of effort, community standing, and cultural identity. To decline involvement felt, in their eyes, like dismissing all of it as a failed investment. Michael saw himself as protecting his immediate family's financial future. They saw him as withholding support at the moment it was needed most. The divide was no longer subtle. It was visible in every silence at dinner, every avoided glance, every strained holiday conversation. The final family meeting was arranged with an unspoken understanding that a definitive answer would be delivered. It took place again at Frank and Diane's dining table, though this time there was no wine poured casually and no small talk to soften the mood. The folder of documents lay open, thicker than before, with updated figures reflecting mounting pressure from the bank. Frank looked older, more tired, but his posture remained rigid. Laura sat beside Michael, hands folded tightly in her lap. Anthony leaned back with folded arms, already prepared for confrontation. Diane watched quietly, eyes moving between father and son-in-law, as if hoping for compromise. Frank spoke first. He acknowledged that mistakes may have been made, that the industry had changed, that the pandemic had left scars deeper than anyone anticipated. But he insisted that family stands together when outsiders step back. He said the bank had given one final window to restructure the debt if a new guarantor signed within 30 days. His voice sharpened as he reached the heart of his appeal. If you don't step up now, don't expect to be part of this family. The sentence landed with finality. It was not shouted. It was delivered with the quiet authority of a patriarch who believed he was defending more than a business. Silence followed. The weight of the ultimatum filled the room. Laura's breathing grew shallow. Anthony shifted forward, waiting. Michael kept his gaze steady on Frank. He did not respond immediately. He had rehearsed variations of this moment in his mind, but none prepared him for the emotional charge of hearing his place in the family questioned outright. When he finally spoke, his tone was calm, measured, almost subdued. "I'm not setting my children on fire to keep your kitchen warm." The words were not designed to provoke, yet they cut sharply. He continued, explaining that assuming $400,000 in debt without structural control would endanger everything he had built and everything he was building for his children's future. He said he was willing to advise, to help plan a responsible wind-down, to connect Frank with consultants who specialized in distressed businesses. But he would not sign a guarantee that exposed his family to cascading liability. Laura's eyes filled with tears, not from anger alone, but from the realization that the line had been drawn publicly and irrevocably. Frank's expression hardened, pride overtaking vulnerability. Anthony muttered that this was exactly what he expected. Diane lowered her gaze. No one raised their voice further. There was no dramatic explosion, only a deep fracture settling into place. Michael understood in that moment that even if he preserved his finances, he had lost something intangible. The meeting ended without handshakes or reassurances. Chairs scraped softly against the floor as everyone stood. The folder remained on the table, its contents unchanged by the confrontation. On the drive home, neither Michael nor Laura spoke. The streetlights passed in steady rhythm, illuminating faces marked by exhaustion. At home, Laura walked directly to the guest room without another word. Michael remained in the kitchen for a long time, staring at the quiet house he had worked decades to secure. He replayed Frank's ultimatum and his own response repeatedly. He knew the consequences would ripple beyond that evening. He had chosen financial caution over emotional expectation. Whether history would judge that decision as wisdom or betrayal remained uncertain. The house was silent. The restaurant's fate was moving toward its conclusion. And the family, once united by shared meals and shared pride, now stood divided by a signature that never came. 3 months after the night that split the family in half, the courthouse stamped a date that ended a 27-year legacy. The restaurant that had once been the pride of Maple Avenue officially filed for bankruptcy. Vendors who had extended credit for years without hesitation now stood in line with attorneys. Produced suppliers demanded payment. The linen company filed suit. The meat distributor froze accounts. Within weeks, a judge approved the bank's motion to seize the property. The same building that had hosted graduations, rehearsal dinners, and Sunday brunch after church was reduced to collateral. The ovens were cataloged. The wine inventory was audited. The framed photos of smiling customers were boxed and handed back to the family like artifacts from a closed museum. For almost 3 decades, it had survived recessions, a global pandemic, and even a kitchen fire that nearly destroyed the back half of the building. What it could not survive was debt disguised as hope. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what happened next would redefine the meaning of being right and the cost that sometimes comes with it. The call came late on a Tuesday night. Daniel had just finished reviewing quarterly reports for his own company, the same steady income that had made him the only financially stable person in the room months earlier. His phone vibrated. Private number. He let it ring once, twice. Something told him who it was before he even answered. On the other end was Richard, his father-in-law, the man who had once slid a stack of papers across the dinner table and said, "We don't want investors. We want family." The confidence in Richard's voice was gone. There was no argument left to win, no presentation to defend, just exhaustion. After a long pause, Richard said 4 words that landed heavier than any accusation ever had. "You were right." No apology followed. No dramatic confession. Just a quiet admission that the numbers Daniel uncovered had been accurate all along. Revenue had been inflated. Taxes left unpaid. Personal expenses funneled through the business account. The lease, expiring in 18 months, had already been in jeopardy. What had been presented as a temporary cash flow issue had, in truth, been a structure cracking from the inside. Daniel did not celebrate. There was no satisfaction in hearing those words. Being right did not rewind the past 3 months. It did not erase the tension that had grown inside his own home. Emily had defended her family until the final court notice arrived. She had believed the restaurant could be saved if only Daniel would shoulder the debt. When he refused, the disagreement moved from finances to loyalty. She slept in the guest room. Conversations became transactional. The children, old enough to sense friction but too young to understand it, began asking careful questions at dinner. Why doesn't Grandpa call anymore? Why does Mom seem sad? Why don't we visit the restaurant? Daniel had protected the college funds, the mortgage, the savings account built over years of disciplined work. He had refused to absorb $400,000 in debt that was tied to unpaid suppliers, back taxes, and a lease running out of time. Financially, he had done what analysts and advisors would recommend. Emotionally, the cost was harder to measure. The restaurant's closure sent ripples through the extended family. Emily's sister posted online about loyalty and sacrifice. Her brother described Daniel as cold, a man who calculated everything. Richard stopped answering calls for weeks after the bankruptcy filing, ashamed and angry in equal measure. When the bank placed a notice on the door and the locks were changed, neighbors gathered quietly across the street. Some remembered their first dates there. Others had worked part-time in high school washing dishes or serving tables. For the community, it was the end of an era. For the family, it was the end of a shared identity. Daniel watched from a distance. He did not attend the final walkthrough. He did not stand in the empty dining room when the last of the equipment was removed. He understood something many families struggle to accept. A business can fail even when the memories inside it are priceless. Richard's late-night admission did not rebuild Daniel's marriage. It did not automatically restore trust. Emily struggled with conflicting emotions. She saw the unpaid tax notices for herself. She heard from former staff members who had gone weeks without payroll before the closure. She realized the presentation at that dinner months ago had hidden more than it revealed. Yet accepting that truth meant acknowledging that Daniel had been right to question her family's narrative. That realization carried its own weight. Pride can delay healing long after facts are clear. The tension between them lingered in small moments. Who would pick up the kids from school? Who would handle the grocery bill? Who would sit at which end of the table? The argument had started with spreadsheets and balance sheets, but it ended in something deeper. It became about belonging, about what it means to stand with family when the ground beneath them is unstable. In the months that followed, lawsuits settled quietly. The building was listed for lease under new management. The old sign came down. A construction crew painted over the familiar logo that had once symbolized stability. Richard began working part-time consulting for a friend's catering company, a humbling transition for someone who had once owned the establishment outright. At family gatherings, the restaurant was rarely mentioned. It existed like a chapter everyone had read, but no one wanted to discuss. Daniel continued running his company, maintaining the financial discipline that had allowed him to refuse the bailout. Outwardly, his life appeared intact. Inwardly, he questioned whether the fracture in his marriage would fully mend. He had saved the finances. That part was undeniable. The debt had not followed them home. The bank had not attached liens to their property. The children's future remained secure. Yet security is not the same as harmony. The story does not end with a dramatic reconciliation or a triumphant return. It ends in a quieter place. A man who chose caution over obligation. A father-in-law who eventually acknowledged reality. A marriage navigating the space between vindication and vulnerability. The restaurant is gone. The debt was real. The warning signs were there long before the final dinner. Daniel saw them, investigated them, and refused to ignore them. History may record the bankruptcy as a business failure. The family will remember it as a turning point. Because sometimes the hardest choice is not whether to save a building, but whether saving it would cost everything else. He preserved his finances. The question that lingers is whether, in doing so, he sacrificed something less visible but equally valuable. And that is where this story leaves us, with the quiet understanding that being right does not always feel like winning.